Hello, everyone listening. We are back on the Religion of Human Nature podcast. We got a really special show, special mainly because I actually know my two guests fairly well, and I love my guests a lot. They're two really incredible people, and I'm not just saying that because they're on camera right now. I've known Bob Morgan for a really, really long time, back to our days at the University of Illinois. Bob is the state representative of the 58th District in the state of Illinois. Bob, how are you doing today?
I'm doing great. Thanks for having me. It's always great to be with you. And I love the montage background. I'm not sure if that's a photo of the books or those are actual books behind
They're my actual books. Depending on who my guests are, I sometimes move basketballs in the background and bobbleheads, but I figured with you two, I could leave my Jewish books up and still feel pretty safe and cool. And Zander Abrams, who is the founder and principal of the Cannabis Policy Forum, all the way in Los Angeles or California, Santa Monica. Zander, how you doing?
I'm doing well. So somehow I'm one of the only people in my friendship groups and on Zoom calls that have gotten like a tan or a sunburn throughout the quarantine. So I'm very fortunate to be out here in LA.
Well, it's great to really have you both. Today we are talking about the legalization of marijuana, cannabis, whatever you want to call it. A really important topic. I think right now during COVID-19, which this is being recorded during, even more important to talk about and what happens after this and how policy is made around cannabis, and also like people stuck at home and adults looking just to like have a break from life and however they're spending their day. I'm gonna start with you, Bob, because you played a critical role in the legalization of marijuana in the state of Illinois. So what was your role and why was it so important to the state of Illinois specifically?
So I've had two roles in cannabis legislating and policy in Illinois. My first job was to be the initial director of the medical cannabis program. That dates back to 2012, where I helped Illinois develop our medical program. That was a completely different world than we have today, cannabis and otherwise, obviously. And you can go down the list of all the ways the world has changed. But Illinois passed our medical statute in 2013, and I was assigned the job of implementing that program and spent the next 2.5 years getting medical cannabis program up and running, issuing the licenses, making sure patients had access, working with regulators around the country. And then I left that job after there was a change in administration, new governor, and for the last 2 years have been in the Illinois legislature and was actively involved as one of the stakeholders that passed legalization in Illinois. So I've been involved in a couple different ways, and also private practice lawyer where I practice cannabis law in states outside of Illinois. So way more cannabis policy in my life than I ever expected 10 years ago.
So, Bob, why was it specifically so important to the state of Illinois? So at some point, maybe we'll get into like federal versus state and local. And I don't know sure if I have an opinion either way personally, if it's state or federal. But why is it so important to the state of Illinois?
Well, again, they're kind of two different programs, and I think each one has its own singular focus. And the first one for medical really is about the patients. I probably don't have to educate anyone on this podcast about medical cannabis patients and the benefits to those that are suffering from debilitating medical conditions. That's kind of it's a ubiquitous understanding today. 90% of the country supports medical cannabis. So that's not even a discussion point. But back in 2012, this was controversial, more controversial at least. And so that was the big focus in making sure there was a safe product and making sure that these people that were suffering had another avenue to get relief from that pain and nausea and suffering. The adult use program that we passed in Illinois, if you really had to nail it down to one reason why it was so important, it was social equity and criminal justice. Not only was that the focus of me and the other legislators that drafted the law and the governor in Illinois, J.B. Pritzker, it was the reason it passed because we had to go through the state legislature, unlike almost every other state who has gone recreational through ballot initiative, popular vote, referendum. Illinois had to do it through our legislature. And for a variety of reasons, the dynamics of our state government required, not just from a policy and passing legislation perspective, but from a moral perspective, focusing that on making sure we were taking serious, meaningful, unprecedented steps to correct and undo the harms from the war on drugs for the last 40, 50 years.
Thank you. That's interesting. So Zander, you're in California. It's also both medically and recreationally legal. So you left a different role that you had that we know each other from, and you are now to follow Cannabis Policy Forum and to start this, be the founder and principal of this company. So what does your job entail, and what is your mission, and why are you so passionate about it?
Yeah, well, first of all, thank you so much for having me on, Jeremy. We've known each other for a number of years, and I'm really excited to participate in this conversation with you on this topic. So the Cannabis Policy Forum, as a website, it's a nonpartisan, non-corporate financed platform for me to discuss and for others to discuss contemporary issues facing the cannabis industry and really the cannabis movement at large. My background is I am an attorney and I have a background in politics. My dad was a state representative for 17 years and he's been a judge for about 14 years. My mom is a neurologist who specializes in epilepsy. So it's really kind of like that cool meeting of those two issues. Our perspectives on the issue are a little different, but growing up around those conversations really informed me to think critically. I also worked as a political director on a statewide campaign. I worked for a federal lobby for 5 years. So I came into the cannabis industry about a year ago with a perspective of synthesizing the political, the policy, and really the business end of things. So in addition to authorship, interviews, podcasts, thought leadership, I work very discreetly with various cannabis, CBD, trade associations, and ancillary technology companies. And most of my work is focused on strategic initiatives, navigating federal illegality issues under Section 280E, which I'm sure we'll get into a little bit later. And I'm working with some municipalities on their own regulatory issues. And I think more broadly, what I do is I try to give perspective and guidance and action items for us to create a sustainable policy environment that can get passed politically, that's also going to help industry grow.
That's interesting. It's so interesting that we're all in three very different states that recognize this in a different way. So here medical is legal in Minnesota, but it's like you basically have to be terminal from what I know. And so, and I'm watching both of your states and I'm not seeing so much negative effects, although I'm curious to know, has there been things you didn't foresee happening? I don't see like a crazy abuse of it in a way that like all of a sudden there's a spike in crime or a spike in motor accidents or something like that. So describe to me what you've seen, sort of the positive and negatives of your state's legalizing marijuana. It's open.
Sam, go for it.
Okay. So I think that the positives, the number one most positive element that I see from the full adult use legalization. So there's medical and then there's adult use, which is another term for recreational cannabis. I think one of the biggest positives is it's helped snuff out the black market. You've seen in states that have been more free in giving dispensary licenses, states like Oregon, states like Washington, the black market has really gone away because of economics. I did on my website a breakdown of the average cost of ounces in states that have a lot of supply available versus California, which hasn't been great at issuing dispensary licenses. And so if you look at Oregon, the average cost of an ounce in a store is $30 cheaper than the average cost of an ounce on the black market. So as a consumer, I'm going to make the economically rational decision. So that's really number one. Number two that I think is really positive is what Bob alluded to, the social equity program. The fact that people that have been harmed most by the justice system are eligible for fast track for their dispensary license or other licenses. In addition to that, even in like Bob's home state of Illinois, I believe something like 25% of all taxes collected for adult use cannabis sales go to R3 programs that are focused on education, social justice, things of that sort. And then kind of third and finally, for me, the biggest positive has been tax revenue. It's all about the dollars, right? So in just Q1 of 2020, the state of California received over $85 million in tax revenue from one quarter in 2020, just from cannabis sales. And as we look to, in my background is kind of in the state legislatures, from interning and being around it, working with the tax committee on tax policy. And July 15th, Americans are going to file their taxes, and states are going to see massive shortfalls. Minnesota went from a $1 billion budget surplus to a $2.1 million budget deficit projection. And that was before last week. And so states are going to be looking for new sources of revenue. And I think cannabis is really constructive in adding that.
Yeah. I mean, I think, I imagine the religious community in Minnesota is a very Lutheran state. And I imagine that's part of the blockade here.
Still there, Zander? I feel like we just lost Jeremy.
We lost Jeremy.
So does that mean we're still recording and we should just start talking?
Yeah, why not? So, okay. So Bob, what's going on with kind of Illinois with the revenue? I mean, I saw the announcement about new programs, a new grant program created with $45 million. Were you involved in that? It was equity program. It was $31.5 million for restorative grants that the government
it was quite a discussion because, as you know, in your work in government, legislators and governor's offices don't always do a great job of thinking about the actual pragmatic economics. They just see tax revenue and they want to go after it. And we spend a lot of time talking about what's realistic, what are our priorities in this taxation scheme, and where should that money go? So as you alluded to, R3, the money that we put into social equity and the communities and community grants was not accidental, but it was a fight because everybody wanted the money. Government wants the money for normal expenses, our general revenue fund. There were those that wanted us to spend that money to pay off our debts. Illinois has its share of debt, obviously, and pension debt liability. There were those that wanted the money to go to law enforcement. And it just went on and on of everybody wanting more money. But as you know, the money that you raised disproportionately, there's an inverse relationship. And here comes Jeremy. Let's see. Mm-hmm. Hey, Jeremy.
Hey, is it still recording?
Yeah, we've been continuing on with the discussion, so you can hop back in. Bob was giving us a breakdown of how the money's being allocated in Illinois for tax revenue. Yeah.
Yeah. All right, then let's get. I'm on a totally new computer. My computer literally just said it needs an update, and okay, so we're back. Great, keep going. Let's keep riding. This way I don't have to.
And we were just talking about taxation in Illinois and how we got to that and what we're doing with the money. And it was very intentional in the negotiations about dedicating a substantial percentage of our tax revenue to the communities that have been disproportionately impacted by the war on drugs. And there was a lot of thought about how to do that. For instance, normally government creates a grant and they give you the specific parameters of where you can spend that money, how much you can get and where it goes and what you do with it. But that's not how communities work. Communities have different needs. And so we recognized that and created a grant program that was driven by the community asking for whatever it is that they need most. So the parameters are much more of identifying the communities that need it and letting the communities tell the state where that money should go. So we're just at the early stages of that. That money is just starting to go out the door. And as you mentioned, with the world with COVID-19, the needs of the communities they're just exponential. The ones that are, again, I think everyone listening to this and the two of you definitely know the people in the communities hit most by COVID-19 are those without a primary care physician, are those that are frontline essential business workers, those that already had compromised immune systems and significant healthcare issues and systemic healthcare issues, people that had to work 2 or 3 jobs to support their families. And those are where we're seeing the real significant impacts of all of this. It's not really my community. And that's what we spent when we were talking before we went live, we were down in Springfield a couple of weeks ago and we did the best we could to allocate the federal dollars we had coming in to those communities in particular, which again, really goes towards values. We certainly could have sent more money to small businesses and large businesses, for that matter, who are struggling in more affluent communities, but we deliberately tried to target those communities that were just getting hammered, and will continue to.
See, and I apologize if I missed this, my own podcast, but so what about the negative impact? Are you seeing things that like you didn't expect? Zander, are you trying to protect against things you're seeing in other states or that can pop up?
So with the negativity, when I reflected on that question, I was like, okay, there's kind of the obvious negative things about the cannabis industry, like at large, which is it was largely a black market. It was people that were intentionally breaking the law. You can kind of tell when you go to California, which is a very mature, I think California is the most mature cannabis market, which is what drew me to California. It was like, if I'm going to work in the cannabis industry, I want to be at the place that's on the forefront of the cannabis industry and the forefront of American culture. And so there's kind of that previous element. But I think today, how I look at it for my clients and how I look at it for myself, most of the negativity comes from the federal illegality of it. And primarily things like you can't access financial services. So cannabis is a level 1 drug under the Controlled Substance Act. So that means it is the highest schedule. Other level 1 drugs include heroin. Other like what I consider serious drugs are considered level 2 or level 3. But because of the level 1 nature, there's things like insurance, banking, payment processing that you don't have access to. And so, for example, the cannabis industry in California is largely cash-based. So that means that you're dealing with large amounts of cash. It's held in safes or cash on hand. You're paying your employees in cash. So you become a greater target for crime. You become a greater and easier pass-through for cartels. And you also have a lot of trouble with transparency for regulators. So I think those access to financial services, which is a result of the federal illegality, is one of the biggest negatives about the industry. And just to like put a personal face on this, one of the trade associations that I work with is the focus on equity retailers in the state of California, people from the social equity track. Through the looting that's happened as part of the last week's events, a lot of these stores don't have any insurance because they can't buy insurance policies in the United States. I've had to help procure insurance policies for some clients, and they're offshore policies. They're very limited, super high premiums. So these cannabis stores that are getting ransacked and looted, they have no insurance to cover it. And they're already not operating with like significant profits. So you're seeing these mom and pop shops, the people who the system was set up to protect, unable to get insurance policies. Their businesses are looted. They're dealing in cash. So that's where I'm seeing a lot of the negativity.
Bob, what about you? What about in Illinois? Have there been any push, like things that you just were shocked after they became legal that, maybe you would have thought about differently or has made others nervous about it?
Well, you got to start with the context, right? So Illinois, again, is not California. And what I mean by that is, aside from the obvious, it doesn't have the long, decades-old culture of integration of cannabis culture and cannabis consumption as much more of like kind of normal aspect of society. We didn't have that, and still to some degree don't in Illinois. And so we've approached it, Zander alluded to this a little bit earlier too, about just limited licenses. That has an economic impact, but that also is more of a factor of how do we pass a law through legislature that everyone's not going to freak out about. And if we had as many licenses as Oregon had, hundreds and hundreds relative to their, and of course, Oregon's a much smaller state population, that wouldn't have passed in Illinois. And so, I start with, what did we expect? I think by and large, this has been what we expected. There haven't been, as I think about the last 6 months, I can't think of anything that was shocking in what happened or what didn't happen. If anything, the only thing I'm most surprised by, usually media has a specific trajectory on this. They start with a lot of excitement about a new industry, particularly cannabis. They love writing stories about cannabis. They love writing stories about grandma using cannabis for the first time since Woodstock. And then usually after that, it goes towards, well, government messed something up, so there's a transparency issue or corruption issue. And then it becomes all the negative impacts of cannabis. So you start talking about job testing, and then you start talking about access to banks, you start talking about social equity, and then the real negatives, the first person to get pulled over for driving while intoxicated under cannabis. And that becomes a huge story. And then you have to ask yourself, well, people were driving high a year ago. They just weren't doing it under state legal cannabis laws. We have not had stories like that in the last 6 months. And that's the most surprising thing to me, that the negative stories, and I think part of that has to do with COVID-19, part of that has to do with the way that this has been rolled out relatively successfully in Illinois. But that's the only thing that I'm truly surprised by, that the lack of truly negative stories that the media is perpetuating.
So what's next step? So we talked about some of the potential negative impacts. We talked about the positive, but some of the obstacles to getting it to, like, really, I think Zander, you touched on some really important points. So what are the next steps? How do you two help refine it? Because like anything, there's going to be, synagogue policy, for example. We might pass it because we think it's a good idea. And then out of the blue, there could be an impact that we just, we calculated all the risks, whatever, and we missed one thing, or we didn't expect something to happen. So what are the next steps for both of your states as you see them, and maybe specifically your jobs?
So I see, that's a really, really big question, Jeremy. It's a huge question. We could do a whole podcast dedicated to what is the future of cannabis policy, or the cannabis infrastructure. I personally, I think everything comes down to people. People make the difference. And the type of people that are now going into cannabis, the cannabis industry in the last 18 to 24 months, have been people like me, people that are attorneys, people that are investment bankers, people that were consultants, people that come from a great business background or a great political background, and have decided to move into this area of entrepreneurship and business. And so I'm really encouraged by more people like that coming in that can make that impact. I think structurally and politically, having been, in my opinion, spoiled working with AIPAC, which is, in my opinion, the single most effective lobby that the country has, full stop. And learning those types of practices and what AIPAC does and how they operate, and you take a look at how the cannabis industry operates, it's still, very disorganized politically. There is no centralized plan. There is no centralized voice. The type of tactics and strategies that the broader cannabis movement is using politically is largely tactics that those of us who are active with AIPAC or the pro-Israel community know that we adopted and we abandoned in the 80s because we know it's ineffective. So I think that there's some growing that needs to be done on a political and on a level like that. I think we need more impressive people to come in the industry. And I think that there's a couple pieces of federal reform that might be a little too granular, things like the States Act, things like safe banking, perhaps a rescheduling of marijuana from Schedule 1 to Schedule 3 that has to be done. But I'm an optimist, and I think that the future is very, very bright for our industry.
Bob?
There's a lot to do. Normally, when I think about or talk about the cannabis industry in the future, both state and federal, it's usually in a 3 to 6 month window. In the last couple of months, it's been like 2 to 4 weeks. And 2 weeks ago, I would have told you something very, very different. Right now, Illinois is reeling from a couple big problems, some of which are created by us. Some of it is outside our control. For instance, we have not yet issued 75 new dispensary licenses under our recreational law. For those who aren't tracking, when we created a program, I mentioned social equity. The idea was to use as a foundation the existing medical cannabis businesses and ownership, which is predominantly white male owned, but infuse that with a significant number of new businesses that are principally in majority minority owned. That process was imperfect from the start. There's no perfect way to do that anyway, but we had a plan, and we have a plan to get 75 new retail stores open in Illinois in the next 6 to 12 months. Of those 75, the majority should be social equity owned businesses. Those licenses haven't been awarded yet. COVID-19 has been a huge problem in a number of public and private ways about the administration in Illinois getting that out the door. And we've been fighting about that in a lot of different ways, and we need to get those out the door. So that's an immediate problem, and I'm working on that with a number of other people.
And that's not just specific to Illinois. Like in Los Angeles,
right,
there were an estimated 1,200 illegally operating dispensaries pre-2018, and the city of Los Angeles County, there's only 167 dispensaries. There's demand in the black market for over 1,000. And from us, and I think one thing that Illinois did really smartly, that Proposition 64 in California totally messed up on, and I get where they were coming from, but individual city councils in California have the ability to say absolutely no to any cannabis operations. And so 80% of municipalities in California won't allow cannabis at all. And so it's created this like large demand, it's given fuel to the black market. And most importantly, what you said, like there's the 100 equity applicants that were issued their invoice that Los Angeles City Council said, well, we want to pump the brakes on and we want to slow. Like these people have limited financing. They have to have their storefronts up and running. And I don't know, I'd be curious how Illinois is tackling this, because Illinois is the land of MSOs, multi-state operators, with GTI, Cresco, Forefront. You know, how do you guys handle the predatory lending issues with equity applicants? Because they're the most vulnerable. And I had a client, and I took a look at his financing agreement with a multi-state operator that shall remain nameless. And they were offering him like a stupid low interest rate on $2 million. It was like 5% interest or something like that. And I was like, this is too good to be true. And then I looked at the fine print, and it was just a backdoor play for them to basically take the land, take the real estate, and eventually take over the license from the equity applicant. And if he wouldn't have had, you know, legal counsel or me to take a look at it, he would have basically been stripped of his license and not even known it happened. So how in Illinois are you guys tackling that?
Well, we only have 30 minutes for this podcast, right? But no, I mean, Dan, you did an excellent job of nailing one of the many problems that, these structural problems that we haven't quite figured out. I mean, in theory, what would happen is in that kind of a situation, that individual social equity license is going to pay the price for it, because they're not going to be viewed as a true social equity license. They're going to be viewed as a social equity front group, but that's really owned and controlled by a multi-state operator that's white male owned. And they're the ones that are going to be left in the cold, right? So there's no way to unravel that because generally speaking, government's, again, not very good at nailing down these business agreements and management terms and knowing all the different ways that corporate law, will be able to allow these workarounds. And it's going to be imperfect. It's not going to be good. But my hope is that at least some of those businesses will be legitimate. What I've always said is, the 75 dispensary licenses, if 15 of them end up being true social equity applicants, that's a huge win. That's 15 more than we had before. But then we have to make sure that they're getting low interest loans from the state. Illinois did that. So some of the money from revenue from license applications and license fees will go into low interest loans that attempt to deal with some of the banking issues that everyone's facing, but most specifically Black and brown communities that don't have access to institutional capital and venture capital funds and hundreds of millions of dollars. So creating new funding sources for them to be successful, but then cultivating those businesses and making sure that they're supported and they're given a chance to compete and they can't be boxed out of the market. I mean, it's just a huge number of economic challenges that government can try and fix, but the truth is it's very difficult and will take a long time to undo some of these. There are pros and cons of doing what we've done in Illinois. One of the pros is our industry is open generally. I mean, of course, this last week was a significant hit negatively, but our industry is open. We opened on time, largely with what we expected to do. The downside is we just further reinforce the existing system, which has a lot of flaws. And you make it really hard for people to succeed. So it's going to be work. And I'm really excited to have Zander volunteer to come out to Illinois and help us figure it out.
Well, I lived there for 5 years. I think I have a storage unit there.
That's what I'm saying. I'm trying to get you home.
Well, it was like as soon as I left, that was when it went recreational. So when I told people I'm leaving Illinois, I'm changing my life to the cannabis industry, they were like, "Do you know that GTI and Cresco are based in Illinois? And and my kids go to the Anshamet Jewish Day School with so and so as the CEO's kids."
Well, the weather is certainly not comparable. So there's
You're saying Chicago weather is better than LA weather? Is that what you just said, Jim?
No, I did not say that. And I'm in Minnesota.
Chicago's the best city in America in the worst location.
That might be true. There's some truth to that. I think the Twin Cities also could be said that. I mean, like, it's an amazing place to live, and then the winter hits.
Well, bringing it back local with the Twin Cities, Jeremy. I mean, I've read and have been in touch with some folks in Minnesota government about Representative Winkler's proposal for adult use cannabis in Minnesota. And I know that, and I actually wrote an article about this on my website about how in Minnesota, and I don't know how things are going to change politically because of this election, but if it's not number one on the agenda, it's going to be one of the top 5 things if the Democrats can take the Senate, because the governor already had the commissioners create their strategic plan for how it looks like for adult use cannabis to be legal. You have the majority leader in the House as a proponent, and the only red sign has been Senate Majority Leader Paul Gazelka. And I believe the Democrats are behind by like 4 seats in Minnesota. So if they can just flip 4 seats, it's going to be coming to Minnesota in a very real way.
Interesting. Yeah. So I think it's a good way to go to the last question, which is basically like, what are people missing about like the common practice? Let's remove medical. I think, Bob, you hit it nail on the head. I think, I don't think there's really a case in my mind to say that like you can't use medical marijuana. Like, listen, there's reasons in which you might say that, like, oh, if you smoke it whatever, it hurts your lungs, and then you've got all sorts of stuff. But let's talk about common practice. And what did you called it? Adult use?
Yeah.
Okay, so what I would call recreational. So what's like the biggest misconception for someone who's listening, my 35 listeners, what is someone missing about just sort of common practice use, like a misconception that you find all the time when you're talking with people about this?
Well, I mean, I would say and we reacted this way when COVID hit by making cannabis businesses essential businesses. And it was never even a discussion, it was automatic. And the reason for that is a couple-fold. There's economic reasons for it, it's job creation, but the biggest reason is because there's a recognition that recreational adult use, more often than not, is really medical in nature. You might not be a medical patient in terms of a medical card, but you're using it because you're having a hard time sleeping. You're using it because you have pain or aches. A lot of people use cannabis for the recreational reason is really a medical. And I think that when people start to think about that, it changes the way they think of this negative context of recreational use in terms of, hurting themselves or doing it to be lazy and to be lack of, committed employees or just disjointed from society. I mean, really, and disconnected, it's really, for a lot of people, medical. And I think that we are getting to a point slowly, at least in Illinois, again, it's a different culture here than it is in California or Colorado or Washington, Oregon. People are starting to acknowledge that and see it for what it is, as a way to regulate something that can eradicate the illicit market and also help a lot of people that are just not feeling well.
I 100% agree with you what you just said. And I'm just thinking about the athletes. I've always found it so bizarre that the NFL and like pro wrestling places in sport, forget about baseball and basketball for a second, but sports in which hockey, where you take a hit, an impact, and you expect them to play the day later and they can barely lift their arm. It's just crazy to me that like something like marijuana would not be like almost encouraged, because the other drugs they could be using are like life threatening.
Right.
It doesn't even, or you're advocating that they drink, basically, which is just, in my mind, stupid and in a different way. Zander, what do you think?
So I want to take what Bob said and kind of make a sub point on it, because he hit the nail on the head. And this is kind of what a project that I've been working on with someone who, Jeremy, I know you know, and I think that there's going to be this term in this way that we view cannabis going forward, and the language that we're going to be hearing a lot of is functional dosage. I mean, what is your functional dosage of cannabis? Because for some people, cannabis is like coffee. Coffee was considered an illicit substance and was under a lot of strict regulation and highly taxed at one point in world history. And it's startling to me, and this isn't me personally, this isn't how I operate, but a lot of people that I meet in the industry and especially outside of the industry view cannabis as their coffee or their Adderall or some type of just everyday, I feel more confident. It helps me deal with my anxiety and my stress. And there's this idea that people that are getting high are getting just super high, smoking a big joint, sitting on the couch, and marathoning whatever was released on Netflix. And you know, some of us might be guilty of that, and that might be true. But what also is true is that a lot of people are taking small amounts of edibles, you know, 2.5 milligrams of an edible or something like that, and being more productive, more confident, more in tune, and coping with a lot of big issues than they ever have before. So I think we're going to this area of normalization, and I don't think the technology is there yet for people to fully understand what they're taking. And that's another issue, that the fact that bud tenders, that I know two things about bud tenders. I know that they make an average of $14 an hour, and I know that they, you know, last an average of 8 months at a dispensary. And I guess there's a third thing. I know they have one of the most outsized roles in making recommendations to people on what they use. And it's a very highly, it's a very highly scientific substance. Your body is yours. Your body is different from everyone else's. And I think we're going to move to this space where people are able to understand, you know, what works for me to achieve the outcome I'm looking for. And it could be confidence taking the Bima for Yom Kippur services, or it could be, or it could be hitting the boardroom and doing a fundraise.
Zander, you know me well enough that confidence is not what I'm lacking.
Oh yeah, that's some of the other rabbis.
Yeah, I mean, the last year by High Holiday Service, I had to step out of my box because I had to sing. But otherwise, I will say this. You know, I think what you both are saying is incredible. My father studies functional medicine and practices it. So very much, I imagine that this is a part of that, and different sort of herbs that we use for holistic medicine and the way that's looked at. I have a friend who recently was saying that he didn't want to smoke because he was so nervous about COVID-19, but at the same time he needed like something to release sort of that anxiety of just being an employee and being a parent and you know, tutoring his children and also trying to like pay his mortgage. And he's just like, I just wish there was some sort of dosage of marijuana that would allow me to be able to do all that stuff functionally and not also risk, you know. So I agree. I think both of you hit absolutely hit the nail on the head. And I appreciate your time. Either of you want to plug anything you're working on or draw any attention to a charity or a website, or this is the time to do it? Bob, we'll start with you.
Right now, I don't think there's any wrong charity to donate to. So whatever you donated to, double that donation. Go help the people that need it right now. Really appreciate you doing this, but I really think the three of us right now, we're very fortunate, and the people that are listening to this and the people that we know that really need help. Now's the time to be an ally, to be aggressive in our contributions and donations, and find ways to help those that need it most. Beautiful.
Zander?
Well, you can read my work at cannabispolicyforum.com. I think that where our society is at right now in terms of COVID and also the situations over the last week, it's just more important that people are engaged. And you know, support your local Jewish summer camp that's not going to be open this summer. Support your synagogue. Support, you know, community-oriented organizations. I really, really hope that this event will bring different communities closer together.
I mean, yeah, it's bringing a lot of people, especially clergy. You know, we're talking, the conversations are very different, and the expectations are also different, but the conversations are also different, and that's important. It's a step in a direction, and you know, that's what I think we're all hoping, a better world. Just people respecting more people can never be a bad thing. Thank you both. Appreciate your time. Your book, your beautiful poems. Like I said, I think this is the first episode in which even though I'm the rabbi, that we're all Jewish. It might be the first episode that I've done. So that's kind of interesting.
And it's also the longest one.
No, well, maybe. All right. Thank you both for your time and energy.
Thank you, Jeremy.
Good to see you. See you guys.